The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the velvet ropes, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood James Morrison, a quiet man in his early 60s with steel-gray hair and kind blue eyes that held depths most people never noticed. He wore a simple navy jacket and carried himself with an understated dignity that spoke of years of discipline and service. James had served 28 years in the British Army, including multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now retired, he worked as a security consultant and made it a tradition to visit the palace whenever he was in London on business. There was something about watching the young guardsmen perform their duties that reminded him of his own years of service, filling him with both pride and nostalgia. The crowd was typical for a Tuesday morning, families with children pointing excitedly at the red-coated guards, elderly couples sharing memories of their own encounters with royalty, and scattered individuals like James who came for personal reasons. The atmosphere was peaceful and respectful, as it usually was during these ceremonies. Standing about 10 feet away from James was Marcus Webb, though nobody in the crowd knew his name or his reputation. Webb was 34 years old, tall and lean with the kind of nervous energy that made people instinctively step away from him. His clothes were expensive but worn carelessly, a designer jacket that needed cleaning, shoes that had seen better days, and a watch that was clearly stolen. Webb had been drinking since the previous night, trying to wash away the bitter taste of his latest failure. Webb was what the police called a career criminal, someone who had never held an honest job for more than a few weeks and saw crime as his profession. His specialty was targeting tourists, especially older ones who looked like easy marks. He would bump into them, cause a distraction, and make off with their wallets, phones, or jewelry before they realized what had happened. Sometimes he worked with partners, but lately he had been operating alone. His success rate had been dropping, and his desperation was growing. The night before, Webb had tried to rob a young couple outside a restaurant in Covent Garden. It should have been simple. They were distracted, looking at their phones, walking slowly. But when Webb had grabbed the woman's purse, her boyfriend turned out to be much stronger than he looked. Webb had barely escaped, running through narrow alleyways until he lost them. He had spent the rest of the night in a pub, drinking away his anger and planning his next move. Now, standing in the crowd at Buckingham Palace, Webb was looking for an opportunity. His bloodshot eyes scanned the tourists, evaluating each one like a predator sizing up prey. When he spotted James Morrison standing quietly by himself, something in Webb's alcohol-clouded mind decided this was his chance for redemption. James looked perfect for Webb's purposes, older, alone, well-dressed enough to suggest he had money, and seemingly absorbed in watching the ceremony. Webb couldn't see the subtle signs that would have warned a more experienced criminal. The way James positioned himself with clear sight lines in multiple directions, how his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet, or the fact that his hands remained relaxed but ready at his sides. The changing of the guard ceremony was reaching its peak. The old guard was marching out in perfect formation, their red tunics brilliant in the morning sun, their bearskin caps adding to their imposing height. The new guard was approaching from the opposite direction, creating a magnificent display of precision and tradition that had been repeated for centuries. Webb began moving through the crowd, using the distraction of the ceremony to get closer to his target. He bumped into a few people along the way, muttering apologies while his hands checked for easy pickings, but found nothing worth the risk. His focus remained on James Morrison, who continued to watch the ceremony with quiet attention. The crowd pressed closer to the barriers. As the ceremony intensified, children were lifted onto shoulders for better views, and cameras clicked constantly. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and respect for the ancient tradition unfolding before them. Webb was now directly behind James, close enough to smell the older man's subtle cologne and see the quality of his jacket. In Webb's mind, this confirmed his assessment. This was definitely someone with money. He prepared to make his move, planning to bump hard into James, grab whatever he could, and disappear into the crowd before anyone realized what had happened. What Webb didn't know was that, James had been aware of him for the past 5 minutes. Years of training and experience had made James hyper-aware of his surroundings, and Webb's approach had been anything but subtle. James had felt the younger man's eyes on him, noticed the way he moved through the crowd with purpose rather than curiosity, and recognized the body language of someone planning something. James had dealt with countless situations like this during his military service and his current work as a security consultant. He knew exactly what Webb was planning, and he was ready. But James also knew that sometimes the best defense was to let the aggressor make the first move, especially in a crowded public space where innocent bystanders could be hurt. The moment came when the two guards' formations met in the center of the courtyard. The crowd's attention was completely focused on the ceremony, and Webb saw his opportunity. He stepped forward quickly, intending to shoulder-check James hard enough to knock him off balance while his hands went for the older man's pockets. But as Webb moved, something unexpected happened. James turned slightly, not enough to be obvious to the crowd, but enough to see Webb's approach clearly. Their eyes met for just an instant, and Webb felt a chill run down his spine. James's blue eyes were calm, alert, and completely unafraid. In that moment, Webb realized he had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late to back down. Webb committed to his attack, throwing his shoulder forward with all his weight behind it. He expected to send the older man sprawling, creating chaos that would cover his escape. Instead, James Morrison did something that defied Webb's expectations completely, moving with fluid precision that spoke of decades of training. James sidestepped the charge while simultaneously reaching out to control Webb's momentum. What should have been a devastating impact became a controlled redirection that sent Webb stumbling forward. Off balance and vulnerable, the crowd was still focused on the ceremony, unaware that a different kind of drama was playing out just a few feet away. But James Morrison was no longer the quiet, unassuming man who had been peacefully watching the guards. The person who now faced Marcus Webb was someone entirely different, a professional who had spent his entire adult life dealing with threats. Someone who had survived situations that would break most people. Webb tried to recover his balance, his alcohol-impaired reflexes slow and clumsy. He turned back toward James, anger and desperation replacing his initial confidence. He had committed to this course of action, and backing down now would mean admitting defeat. His right hand moved toward his pocket, where he kept a knife that he used more for intimidation than actual violence. James saw the movement immediately and recognized it for what it was. His own posture shifted subtly, his feet finding the perfect stance, his hands moving to positions that would give him maximum options for response. To a casual observer, he still looked like a concerned citizen dealing with an aggressive drunk. To someone with training, he looked like exactly what he was, a professional warrior, who had just identified a threat. Webb's hand closed around the knife handle, his mind racing with confused thoughts about how this simple robbery had gone so wrong. The alcohol in his system made everything seem both urgent and distant at the same time. He could hear the crowd cheering at something in the ceremony, could see the red uniforms moving in perfect formation, but all of that felt far away. His entire world had narrowed to the man standing calmly in front of him. "You made a mistake," James said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise of the crowd. The words were simple, but they carried weight that made Webb's hand freeze on his knife. Webb looked around desperately, suddenly aware that they were surrounded by hundreds of people, including dozens of police officers and security personnel who were focused on protecting the ceremony. He realized that even if he could somehow get past this unexpected opponent, he had nowhere to run. The palace grounds were some of the most secure in the world, and he had just committed assault in front of witnesses, but Webb was too far gone to make rational decisions. The combination of alcohol, desperation, and wounded pride made him pull the knife from his pocket. Holding it low where the crowd couldn't see it, but James certainly could, James Morrison looked at the knife with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the encounter. He had faced armed opponents countless times in his military career, in situations far more dangerous than this crowded courtyard. A drunk criminal with a small knife was hardly the most challenging threat he had ever encountered. The ceremony continued around them, the ancient ritual proceeding with clockwork precision. The guards were completely unaware of the drama unfolding in their audience, their attention properly focused on their duties. But James knew that would change soon. Palace security was too good. The police station in Westminster was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Detective Inspector Michael Brooks sat across from Marcus Webb in a small interview room, studying the man who had made what was possibly the worst tactical decision of his criminal career. Webb's right arm was in a sling, his face was pale, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Let's go through this one more time. Mr. Webb," Detective Inspector Brooks said, his voice patient but firm. He was a veteran detective with 15 years of experience, and he had seen plenty of criminals who thought they were tougher than they actually were. But he had never seen one quite as deflated as Webb appeared to be. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The effects of the alcohol were wearing off, replaced by a pounding headache and a growing sense of dread. "I told you already," he muttered. "I thought he was just some old tourist. I was going to grab his wallet, maybe his phone. I didn't know, Bull quote. Didn't know what?" Brooks prompted. Webb looked up at the detective, his expression a mixture of fear and bewilderment. "I didn't know he was whatever he is." The guy moved like he was 20 years younger. "One second I had a knife, the next second I was on the ground and couldn't feel my arm. I don't even know what he did to me." Brooks nodded, making notes on his pad. He had already spoken with Inspector Chun from Palace Security, and had gotten a preliminary report that painted a very different picture from Webb's version of events. According to the security footage and witness statements, James Morrison had acted with remarkable restraint, using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. "Mr. Webb," Brooks continued, "this was your 4th arrest for robbery in the past 2 years, your 3rd involving a weapon. Help me understand why you thought attacking someone at Buckingham Palace, in front of hundreds of witnesses and dozens of security personnel, was a good idea." Webb slumped further in his chair. When it was laid out like that, his actions sounded even more stupid than they had felt at the time. "I wasn't thinking straight," he admitted. "I needed money, and he looked like an easy target. I was drunk and desperate, and I don't know. I thought I could handle one old man." "One old man," Brooks repeated, making another note. "Mr. Webb, do you know who you attacked?" Webb shook his head. "Some tourist. Rich guy, looked like he had money." Brooks opened a file folder and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table. It was James Morrison's military service photograph, taken 20 years earlier when he was a major in the Special Air Service. Even in the formal military portrait, there was something in Morrison's eyes that suggested depths of experience most people never encountered. "His name is James Morrison," Brooks said. "Colonel James Morrison, retired. 28 years in the British Army, including 12 years with the SAS. He served in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's been awarded the Military Cross twice, the Distinguished Service Order, and about a dozen other decorations for valor under fire." Webb stared at the photograph, his face growing paler with each word. The confident, determined officer in the picture bore only a passing resemblance to the quiet man he had tried to rob. But now that he knew what to look for, Webb could see the steel beneath the civilian exterior. "He's also," Brooks continued, "currently employed as a security consultant by several major corporations and government agencies. His specialties include threat assessment, personal protection, and counterterrorism operations. In other words, Mr. Webb, you attacked one of the most dangerous men in Britain while he was standing in front of some of the best trained soldiers in the world." The interview room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Webb put his head in his hands, finally understanding the full scope of his mistake. He had thought he was robbing a tourist. Instead, he had attacked a man who had spent nearly 3 decades learning how to neutralize threats like him. Meanwhile, 3 floors up in the same building, James Morrison was giving his statement to Detective Chief Inspector Amanda Walsh. The interview was conducted in Walsh's office rather than an interrogation room, reflecting both James's status as the victim and his professional reputation. The subject approached from behind during the ceremony, James was explaining, his voice calm and precise. His body language indicated hostile intent approximately 5 minutes before he made physical contact. He appeared to be under the influence of alcohol and moved with the deliberate purpose of someone planning an assault. DCI Walsh nodded, taking notes on her computer. She had worked with James Morrison several times over the years on cases involving security threats, and she had nothing but respect for his professionalism and judgment. If Morrison said the situation required force, then it had required force. When he made contact, James continued, I redirected his momentum and maintained control of the situation. When he produced the knife, I disarmed him using minimal necessary force. His injuries are consistent with a controlled takedown designed to neutralize the threat without causing permanent damage. The medical report confirms that, Walsh said. Temporary nerve disruption in his right arm, minor bruising, and a mild concussion. Nothing permanent, nothing that won't heal completely within a few weeks. Textbook defensive action. James nodded. I had no desire to seriously injure the man. He was clearly impaired and making poor decisions. But when he produced the weapon, the situation escalated beyond verbal de-escalation. Walsh finished typing her notes and looked up at James. This is clearly a case of self-defense, Colonel. You won't be facing any charges, obviously. But I do have some questions about the sequence of events, just for the record. Of course. You said you were aware of his hostile intent 5 minutes before he acted. Why didn't you move away or alert security? James considered the question carefully. Several reasons. First, in a crowded environment like that, moving away might have simply redirected his attention to another target who would have been less capable of defending themselves. Second, I wasn't entirely certain of his intentions until he made physical contact. And third, I judged that the situation could be controlled with minimal risk to bystanders if handled properly. Walsh smiled slightly. Even in retirement, Morrison thought like a professional soldier, always considering not just his own safety, but the safety of everyone around him. It was exactly what she would have expected from someone with his background. One more question, she said. The security footage shows that you had multiple opportunities to use more force than you did. You could have ended the confrontation much more quickly and decisively. Why didn't you? James was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the London traffic below. Detective Chief Inspector, he said finally, I spent 28 years in situations where the correct response to a threat was overwhelming force. I've been in firefights where the goal was to eliminate the enemy as quickly and completely as possible. But this wasn't war. This was a drunk man making bad decisions in front of a crowd of innocent people. He needed to be stopped, not destroyed. Walsh nodded, understanding completely. It took a special kind of person to maintain that level of discrimination and restraint, especially when under attack. It was one of the reasons James Morrison had been so successful in his military career, and why he was so respected in his current profession. The interview concluded 20 minutes later, with James providing contact information and agreeing to testify if the case went to trial. As he left the police station, James checked his watch and realized he still had time to make his afternoon meeting. The entire incident had taken less than 3 hours to resolve, a testament to the efficiency of both Palace Security and the Metropolitan Police. Back in the interview room, Detective Inspector Brooks was wrapping up his conversation with Webb. The career criminal looked like a man who had just realized that his career might be over. Mr. Webb, Brooks said, closing his notebook, you're looking at charges of assault with a deadly weapon, attempted robbery, and public endangerment. Given your previous convictions, you're probably facing 5 to 8 years in prison. Webb nodded numbly. He had been arrested enough times to know how the system worked, and he knew that his record would work against him. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He had always told himself that he wasn't really a violent criminal, that he just threatened people to get what he needed. But today he had actually tried to stab someone, and only luck and his victim's skill had prevented him from becoming a murderer. There's one thing that might work in your favor, Brooks continued. Colonel Morrison has specifically requested that we inform you of something. Webb looked up, surprised. What? Brooks pulled out another piece of paper. He's recommended you for a veterans rehabilitation program. Apparently, he did some research and discovered that you served in the Army for 18 months before being discharged for misconduct. Webb's eyes widened. His military service was something he never talked about, something he tried to forget. He had enlisted at 18, full of dreams of adventure and glory, but had washed out during his first deployment when he couldn't handle the discipline and responsibility. It was the beginning. 18 months later, Marcus Webb stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his small but clean apartment in South London, adjusting the collar of his security guard uniform. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the desperate criminal who had attacked James Morrison outside Buckingham Palace. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face had filled out from regular meals and exercise, and his eyes held something they hadn't possessed in years: hope. Webb had served 14 months of his sentence before being granted early release on the condition that he complete the veteran rehabilitation program James Morrison had recommended. The program had been the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than prison, harder than his brief military service, harder than the years of scraping by on the streets. It had required him to face every mistake he had made, every person he had hurt, and every opportunity he had wasted. The program director, a former Royal Marine named Sarah Collins, had not made it easy for him. She had pushed him to confront his addiction, his anger, and his deeply rooted belief that the world owed him something. There had been days when Webb had wanted to quit, to walk away and go back to the familiar chaos of his old life. But each time he had been tempted to give up, he remembered James Morrison's calm voice saying that everyone deserved a chance to serve something bigger than themselves. Now, Webb was 3 weeks into his new job as a security guard at a shopping center in Croydon. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and for the first time in his adult life, he was earning money without taking it from someone else. His supervisor, a former police officer named Tommy Hughes, had been skeptical when Webb was hired, but had been impressed by his dedication and attention to detail. "Morning, Marcus," Hughes said as Webb arrived for his shift. "Quiet night last night. Just the usual teenagers trying to sneak into the cinema, couple of shoplifters. Nothing you can't handle." Webb nodded, clipping his radio to his belt and reviewing the overnight incident reports. He had learned to take the work seriously, to see it not just as a job but as a responsibility. The shopping center served thousands of people every day, families, elderly couples, young mothers with children. They deserved to feel safe, and it was his job to make sure they did. "Tommy," Webb said, "I've been thinking about applying for the advanced training program. The one that covers crowd control and emergency response." Hughes looked surprised. The advanced program was intensive and expensive, and most guards were content to stick with the basic requirements. But he had seen Webb's dedication over the past few weeks, had watched him study security protocols during his breaks and volunteer for extra shifts. "It's a big commitment," Hughes warned. 6 months of evening classes, practical exercises, written exams, and the company only pays half the cost. "I know," Webb said. "But I want to do this right. I want to be good at it." Hughes smiled. Webb had come to them with a criminal record and a recommendation from some high-powered rehabilitation program, and Hughes had expected to be babysitting a charity case. Instead, he had found someone who approached the work with an intensity that impressed even the veterans on his team. "I'll put in a word with the regional manager," Hughes said. "If you're serious about this, we'll make it happen." Across London, in the gleaming offices of the Ministry of Defense, James Morrison was reviewing case files for the Veteran Transition Support Program he now headed. The program had grown beyond even Sir David Hartwell's initial vision, expanding from a small pilot project to a comprehensive support network that helped hundreds of former service members every year. James's office walls were covered with letters from program graduates, men and women, who had found new purpose and direction after struggling with the transition to civilian life. Some had gone on to successful careers in business, others had found fulfillment in public service, And a few had even returned to military service with renewed commitment and perspective. His assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Evans, knocked on his door and entered with the morning briefing papers. "Colonel," she said, "I have the quarterly reports from all our regional centers. Overall success rates are up 12% from last year." James reviewed the statistics with satisfaction. Success in this context meant more than just avoiding trouble. It meant finding meaningful work, maintaining stable relationships, and contributing positively to their communities. It was exactly the kind of outcome he had hoped for when he had accepted the position. "There's one case I thought you might be particularly interested in," Evans continued, pulling out a specific file. "Marcus Webb from the London program. He's been selected for advanced security training and has applied to join the Metropolitan Police Special Constabulary." James looked up, surprised and pleased. He remembered Webb clearly, the desperate, angry man who had tried to rob him outside. Buckingham Palace had seemed like a lost cause at the time. But James had learned over the years that people were capable of remarkable transformations when given the right support and opportunities. "How's his progress been?" James asked, opening Webb's file. "Exceptional," Evans replied. "Clean record. Since his release, steady employment, positive reports from his supervisors. His program counselor says he's become something of a mentor to newer participants." James smiled. It was exactly what he had hoped would happen, but it still filled him with a sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional success. Every person who found their way back was a victory not just for them, but for everyone who had believed in them along the way. "Schedule a meeting with him," James said. "I'd like to hear about his experience in the program and his plans for the future." That afternoon, Marcus Webb found himself in the strange position of walking back into a government building voluntarily. The last time he had been in an official setting like this, he had been in handcuffs. Now he was wearing his security uniform and carrying identification that showed he was employed and contributing to society. The meeting was scheduled in a conference room rather than James's office, a neutral space that would make the conversation feel less formal and intimidating. When Webb entered the room and saw James Morrison for the first time since the incident, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: shame, gratitude, and something approaching respect. James stood up and extended his hand. "Mr. Webb," he said, "thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Webb shook the offered hand, noting that James's grip was firm but not crushing, professional but not cold. "Thank you for seeing me, sir, and thank you for everything." James poured 2 cups of tea from a service on the side table and offered one to Webb. "I've been following your progress through the program. I'm impressed by what you've accomplished." Webb accepted the tea, his hand steady despite his nervousness. "I almost quit 3 times, he admitted. "The first month was hell." Sarah Collins, the program director, she didn't let me get away with anything. Every excuse, every attempt to blame someone else, she called me on it. "That's her job," James said. "And it sounds like she did it well." They talked for the better part of an hour, with Webb describing his journey through the rehabilitation program and his plans for the future. James listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering occasional observations based on his experience with hundreds of similar cases. "I keep thinking about that day," Webb said eventually. "About how stupid I was, how close I came to ruining everything completely. If you hadn't been there, if it had been someone else." "But it was me," James said simply. "And you're here now, making different choices. That's what matters." Webb looked across the table at the man he had once tried to rob, trying to understand. The kind of person who could respond to an attack with an offer of help. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you recommend me for the program? Most people would have just been happy to see me locked up." James was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Webb," he said finally, "I spent 28 years in the military. I've seen what happens when good people make bad choices, and I've seen what happens when they're given a chance to make better ones. You weren't evil that day. You were lost. There's a difference." As the meeting concluded, James made an unexpected offer. "We're always looking for people with real-world experience to speak to new program participants," he said. People who have been where they are and can show them that change is possible. Would you be interested in sharing your story? Webb was stunned. The idea of standing in front of a group and talking about his mistakes, his time in prison, and his struggle to rebuild his life was terrifying. But it was also an opportunity to give back, to help others the way he had been helped. "I'd be honored," he said. 6 months later, Marcus Webb stood in front of a group of 25 newly enrolled program participants in a community center in East London. Some looked skeptical, others desperate, and a few appeared to be there only because a judge had given them no choice. Webb recognized the expressions. He had worn all of them at various times. 2 years ago, he began, I tried to rob a man outside Buckingham Palace. I was drunk, desperate, and convinced that the world owed me something. I pulled a knife on him and he took it away from me like I was a child. I ended up in handcuffs, facing serious prison time and wondering how my life had gone so wrong. The room,